Shortly after the Second World War came to an official end, General Vo Nguyen Giap of the Vietnamese Liberation Army met with General Leclerc, who is often called the Liberator of Paris. Giap conveyed his thoughts by saying, "The first resistance fighter of Vietnam is delighted to meet the first resistance fighter of France." In 1946, the French returned to bombard Haiphong port, causing the deaths of 6,000 civilians as a means to regain their former dominance. Vietnam's struggle for independence spanned 3 decades, ultimately leading to the expulsion of the French and even humbling the United States, the world's leading superpower. The contrast between Giap's motivational remarks and the grim reality of the warfare he commenced highlighted the complex nature of the Second World War. Was it truly a quest for freedom, or just a way to maintain existing authority? French Indochina consisted of Vietnam's 3 provinces, Tonkin in the north, Annam in the center, and Cochinchina in the south, along with Cambodia and Laos. France publicly claimed that its officials in these areas were engaged in an immense task for the sake of the Indochinese population. However, the story unfolding in Paris was remarkably different. No country in the world offers as many resources. There are so many industries to be created, so many brilliant financial operations to be performed. So what are you waiting for? Go ahead. By the 1930s, these brilliant financial ventures had concentrated 2/3 of the colony's production in foreign hands, while ensuring that European civilians earned an income 102 times that of the local peasants. This system depended heavily on military force, with more than half of the 42,000 European residents being soldiers. The impact of this colonial history on the Second World War is a topic of discussion. The Indochinese Communist Party asserted that the development of a local ruling class was so minimal that significant social divisions among the Vietnamese had faded. Ho Chi Minh, the party's leader, claimed he was adhering to the principles outlined in the Communist Manifesto, which suggested that the working class of each nation should organize itself into a national class and establish national identity. If this assertion holds true, it would undermine the likelihood of grassroots uprisings with their social and economic consequences, turning Marx's well-known call for unity among workers on its head. The belief of the Indochinese Communist Party that communism could be easily merged with patriotism was seriously misguided. Even though they were few in number, affluent Vietnamese landowners and entrepreneurs had a per capita income that greatly exceeded that of the European civilian population, being 122 times greater than that of the peasant class. The Second World War exacerbated this social divide in various ways. Isolated from France, the colony needed to appoint its own administrators, which resulted in a significant increase in middle and senior positions. By 1944, 75 out of 92 companies were run by Vietnamese individuals. The French deliberately empowered local landlords to establish a supportive social foundation for their regime, with just 6,200 people owning 45% of the rice-growing land in the southern region. In the Red River Valley, only 2% of households possessed 50% of the land. The war brought about soaring food prices, hoarding, speculation, substantial profits for a select group, and serious struggles for the majority. While recognizing the social aspect, it does not lessen the importance of the national fight. From 1941 onward, Vietnam was under the control of not just one, but 2 imperial powers. Japan regarded Vietnam as a vital base for its campaign in China. While Japan replaced European administrations in various areas, in Indochina, it made an agreement with Vichy France. Governor-General Jean Decoux, a devoted supporter of Pétain who targeted Jews and Gaullists, was allowed to remain in power in return for allowing Japanese military bases. Vichy diplomats considered it a miracle to preserve a peaceful and prosperous island of Western civilization amidst Japanese occupation. Astonishingly, when France was liberated, Charles de Gaulle retained Decoux in his position, fearing that disrupting his regime might lead to increased Chinese intervention supported by their American allies, even more than he disliked the supporters of Pétain. As a result, the Free French government in Paris must take responsibility for the famine in Tonkin in 1945. Like other famines throughout history, this one was orchestrated. proper distribution of food could have averted starvation, despite poor weather and pests causing a 1/5 decrease in the northern rice harvest. Nevertheless, the French army exported 10 or more boatloads of rice from the afflicted area each day. Local hoarders and speculators exacerbated the situation. In Hanoi, the capital of Tonkin, food prices surged by 373% within a mere 3 months. Authorities observed bodies lying along the streets, gaunt and clothed in little more than strips of straw, their only burial attire. It was enough to make one feel a deep sense of shame about humanity. Estimates indicate the death toll could reach as high as 2 million. Following this, the Japanese dismantled the remnants of French rule. In November 1944, as the United States readied itself to reclaim the Philippines, Japan's Southern Army relocated its general headquarters from Manila to Saigon, taking complete control of Vietnam on March 9th. This seizure by Tokyo led to significant political repercussions, though those affected by famine experienced little change as grain requisitioning continued. The Japanese reinstated the enemy's Emperor Bao Dai in his palace in Hue, providing the facade of autonomy and limited control over Vietnam. By siding with the Axis powers, Bao Dai and the nationalist groups that worked with him lost any chance of leading a future independence movement. This paved the way for the Indochinese Communist Party to emerge as the undisputed leader in the quest for freedom. Still, the Indochinese Communist Party did not assume this position easily. Its approach gradually shifted from allegiance to the Allies to direct confrontation with them. To understand the reasons for this shift, one must follow the party's intricate path, shaped by French repression and Stalinist politics. The founding declaration of the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930 aimed for the total independence of Indochina, aspiring to overthrow French imperialism, Vietnamese feudalism, and the reactionary bourgeoisie. The party sought to seize all lands and properties owned by imperialists and the Vietnamese bourgeoisie, redistributing them to destitute peasants. However, these lofty ambitions presented the party with considerable difficulties right from the start, and that same year, the collapse of the Nenge Tin Soviet movement led to the imprisonment of thousands of communists. A decade later, the Indochinese Communist Party aligned itself with the Popular Front strategies of the Communist International, which starkly contrasted with its previous stance. It was advised to refrain from making radical demands like national independence or parliamentary representation, as doing so would only serve the interests of Japanese fascists. The focus should be on asserting democratic rights and guaranteeing freedoms of organization, assembly, press, and speech. It is essential to advocate for a general amnesty for political prisoners and secure the right of the party to function legally. To accomplish this, the party must aim to create a broad democratic national front. This front should not only include individuals from Indochina, but also include progressive French citizens residing there. It should bring together the working class and the national bourgeoisie, with the party adopting a cautious and flexible stance towards the national bourgeoisie to encourage their involvement and maintain their loyalty. While the national bourgeoisie may currently be viewed as partners, Trotskyists, who continued to endorse policies that had previously been favored by the Communist International Party, became opponents. There was no possibility for compromise. Instead, the emphasis shifted to revealing them as agents of fascism and working to politically eliminate them. Despite efforts to modify tactics and reach out to the French community, the Communist International Party became a target of violent anti-communist repression following the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Arrests interrupted communication within the organization, and the central leadership lost the firm authority typical of powerful communist groups. Leadership was unable to stop members from engaging in ineffective uprisings against the French in regions such as Baksan in the north and Cochinchina in the south. In the latter instance, the group was overwhelmed by aircraft, armored vehicles, and artillery, resulting in the devastation of entire villages. Lacking handcuffs, authorities bound the limbs of detainees with telegraph wire. When prisons became overcrowded, the French shoved detainees onto boats anchored in the Saigon River. The precise number of deaths during this period of white terror is unclear, but likely surpassed 2,000, with up to 8,000 people detained, many of whom later died in custody or faced execution. In contrast, 3 French citizens and 30 prominent Vietnamese figures lost their lives. These incidents intensified the Communist International Party leadership's fears about pursuing a people's war. To highlight the difficulties faced, Ho Chi Minh lived in exile from 1911 to 1941 under various aliases. A well-known anti-colonial leader criticized him, insisting that he should return home to take charge instead of living abroad. Ho argued that this approach was pointless, as local fighters were under constant watch and fervently pursued on their own land. His viewpoint changed during the Second World War, when he asserted in his letter from abroad that the time for liberation had truly come. France cannot aid its colonialists in governing our nation. As for the Japanese, they are caught up in China and are impeded by British and American forces, which stops them from fully directing their strength against us. If our people fully unite, we can overcome the well-trained armies of both the French and the Japanese. Fellow countrymen, it is time to rise. Yet progress remains sluggish. Even on the verge of taking power in the August 1945 revolution, the party had roughly 5,000 members, many of whom were imprisoned. The party's military force was also quite limited. Meanwhile, the Japanese stationed 57,000 troops in Vietnam, along with many more experienced Allied forces ready to quash any independence movement after the war. Given these realities, the Vietnamese Independence Coalition Party adopted a cautious stance. Ho advised against hasty mass actions, believing they could deplete our resources. Instead, he suggested a 3-phase strategy inspired by the Chinese Communist Party. First, party members would establish a revolutionary base in a remote area, then recruit peasants, and finally, the party would launch an assault on the towns to seize power. Ho Chi Minh, after years with the Communist International, still paid lip service to the working class but effectively sidelined mass movements and overlooked urban workers. The initial step in his plan involved forming an armed propaganda brigade for the liberation of Vietnam, which indicated their ultimate aim while deliberately avoiding direct confrontation. Then, in May 1941, the decision was made to create the Vietnam Independence League, or Viet Minh. This united workers and peasants with landlords, capitalists, officials, soldiers, intellectuals, clerks, and shopkeepers, all increasingly agitated by the intolerable actions of the French and Japanese. They were prepared to fight for Vietnam's liberation and aligned themselves with those who would become known as the Allies. The price of forming an alliance with this faction, which included supporters of Charles de Gaulle, was the delay of demands from the working class and impoverished peasants in favor of a wider national liberation movement. Consequently, the Viet Minh turned down land redistribution, a crucial issue impacting the livelihoods of 90% of the population. Neil argues that the stance of the Communist Party of Vietnam can be traced back to its social roots. At first, it attracted educated people who later guided the villagers they knew. These individuals came from the landlord class, but were repulsed by its corruption and cruelty. They intended to dismantle the previous order and establish a modern industrial state, which contributed to the Communist Party's ongoing hesitation about land reform. Ho Chi Minh's efforts to forge a cross-class alliance were so fervent that outside observers frequently questioned his communist identity. For example, the Times noted that there were essentially 2 main parties at that time, the Viet Minh and the Communists. Ho's approach even led to the formal dissolution of the Communist Party in November 1945, an unprecedented action within the international communist movement. However, altering policies did not guarantee support from the Allies. With the Soviet Union being unreachable, Ho turned to warlords associated with Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalist leader, who were active near the Sino-Vietnamese border and could provide weapons and sanctuary if needed. Seeking their assistance, he established a base in a cave in Cao Bang in February 1941. The precariousness of Ho's circumstances became clear when he was captured for a year by a formerly cooperative warlord. Due to the uncertainty of Chinese support, he sought alternative sources of aid. At one point, he even showed readiness to negotiate with the French, who were genuinely dedicated to opposing the Japanese. General Giap contacted Commander Rohl of France, but a formal agreement remained elusive. American support appeared to be a more hopeful option, with signs that the United States might back the Viet Minh and resist the return of French colonialism. When Franklin Roosevelt spoke about Vietnam with Joseph Stalin at the Tehran Conference in 1943, they both fully agreed that France should not regain authority in Indochina. The president indicated that the United States was exploring a trusteeship arrangement with China, designed to prepare the people for independence within a specified period, possibly ranging from 20 to 30 years. This form of paternalism was in line with post-war aspirations, as Europe's territories in Asia were intended to be opened up and brought under America's considerable economic influence, with four major powers, Russia, Britain, the United States, and China, holding global sway. France was not yet part of this plan. However, support from the United States for the Viet Minh would be short-lived. As World War II drew to a close, the dynamics of the Cold War began to change. The nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek was falling apart, while de Gaulle's France became crucial in countering Russian influence in Europe. Just 4 days before he died in April 1945, Roosevelt let go of his trusteeship idea. By May, the Secretary of State of the United States was mistakenly claiming that the government had not issued any formal statements challenging French authority over Indochina. These shifts in policy created confusion in East Asia. For example, the United States Air Force carried out several operations to support the French during their brief struggle against Japan's blow. However, shortly afterward, agents from the Office of Strategic Services worked with Ho Chi Minh, even bringing him on as an agent, while a team led by Major Allison Thomas traveled to train Viet Minh fighters. Although the United States provided only 12% of the armament, the psychological advantage for the Viet Minh was immense, as they became associated with the victorious Americans. By Victory over Japan Day, the United States had clearly transitioned to supporting French claims, distancing itself from Ho. Major Thomas, who was assigned to oversee the Japanese surrender in Hanoi, was informed by his superiors that he was not to facilitate it under any circumstances. This news was shocking and deeply disheartening for him, but he grasped the rationale. America could not appear to be in cooperation with Ho, as the French were seen as allies while the Viet Minh were viewed as a covert group opposing them. Consequently, despite his efforts, Ho was unable to obtain ongoing support from any of the major allies, France, China, or the United States. Nonetheless, his approach remained clear and closely linked to an expected Allied landing. On March 12, 1945, the Central Committee of the Indonesian Communist Party emphasized that we should not simply wait for the Allied forces to establish a base. We need to endure until they begin making advances as well. At the same time, we must await the Japanese deployment of troops to the front, which would allow us to intercept the Allies and expose their rear before we start a widespread uprising. However, Ho's strategy was not strictly aligned with imperialist agendas. He was not naive enough to accept declarations like the Atlantic Charter without skepticism, and while waiting for the Allies, he envisioned a mass movement to counter any attempts to restore French authority. Meanwhile, the Viet Minh mostly avoided direct clashes with Japanese forces. From March to May, their efforts resulted in the loss of about 50 Japanese soldiers. Some believe the Japanese saw this as a nuisance, but it was nowhere near the resistance witnessed in Yugoslavia or from the Chinese Red Army. The few skirmishes were just isolated events. There wasn't enough combat to classify as armed struggle. Everything shifted when Japan faced imminent defeat, creating a power vacuum that allowed the aspirations of everyday Vietnamese people to surface. The Viet Minh, despite its limited size and focus on organized military units, emerged as a central figure in the People's War in the north and as a substantial force in the south. Mar highlights the complex relationship between grassroots movements and the small circle of communists. While many of the upheavals in August were sparked by Viet Minh slogans, developed or endorsed by experienced Indonesian Communist Party members, and almost everyone rallied under the Viet Minh banner, which would soon become the national symbol, Many local groups identifying as Viet Minh were largely unaware of the organization's true principles and had little connection to the general headquarters. The many people's committees and revolutionary committees that replaced various royal officials and appointed councils were not merely extensions of central authority or fronts for Indonesian Communist Party members. Many of these groups aimed to rectify past injustices or harbored radical social revolution ambitions. The People's War emerged because the official Indonesian Communist Party policy was largely disregarded by the masses. Many rejected the politics of class compromise and advocated for land redistribution, igniting a property upheaval that overwhelmed the government. French authorities in Tonkin noted a troubling trend. Between 1942 and 1943, there were only 4 Viet Minh incidents, but this figure skyrocketed to 80 in 1944. In areas suffering from famine, the local Viet Minh highlighted the urgent need for grain, leading to demonstrations armed with spears and machetes. Over 75 warehouses in the Red River Delta were affected. By the summer of 1945, widespread discontent reached a breaking point, prompting the Indochinese Communist Party to take action. In June, the Viet Minh declared a liberated zone in the north, with 100,000 people, approximately 1 in 10 residents, joining its militia, while the rest of the country had only 80,000 supporters. On August 12th, a general uprising was called, followed by Military Order No. 1 the next day, which launched an attack on the Japanese in order to seize their weapons. However, the Indochinese Communist Party struggled to effectively manage the ongoing People's War. The vast distance of 1,650 kilometers across the country meant that from late 1940 to June 1945, there was no direct communication between the leadership in the north and those in Cochinchina. Competing movements in the south challenged the leadership of the Viet Minh. One such group was the Vanguard Youth, initially inspired by French scouting and sports, which evolved into a political entity due to the war. Although it had a large following, it lacked the unity of the Viet Minh, hindered by the various political and religious factions within. Another rival was Trotskyism, which rejected the Indochinese Communist Party's strategy of establishing a cross-class alliance in phases, instead advocating for a clear distinction between socialism and nationalism. This viewpoint gained considerable traction in Cochinchina, even surpassing the Communists in the 1939 Colonial Council elections. The Trotskyist leader, Tatu Tau, dismissed the notion of merging communism with patriotism, claiming the true divide was between the exploiters and the exploited, rather than among capitalist nations. In Vietnam, workers and peasants faced a dual threat of colonialism alongside the native bourgeoisie. Tatu Tau regarded the Second World War as an opportunity to exploit the conflict among capitalist nations to liberate the working class. For this to succeed, the working class needed to express clear demands. However, Japan's unexpected surrender threw off Ho Chi Minh's strategy to align with the advancing Allied forces in his quest for power. The Viet Minh ultimately emerged victorious, but events played out in ways the leaders did not foresee. Tonneson points out that in August, the Indochinese Communist Party found itself sidelined, just as an opportunity for a traditional urban revolution presented itself. In cities like Hanoi and Hue, the August Revolution sprang up spontaneously, fueled by enthusiastic youth and grassroots activists, all while party leaders remained in their secluded stronghold in Tan Trao. The Nationalist Democratic Party in Hanoi kicked off the first mass gathering on August 16th, declaring that only a revolution by all citizens could foil the ambitions of imperialist powers. Yet, they were quickly outflanked by a Viet Minh supporter who took the stage and energized the crowd for her organization. As the only well-organized party in the revolutionary landscape, the Indochinese Communist Party and its Viet Minh Front swiftly regained their footing. Overlooking the cautious stance of the central leadership, the Communist Regional Committee called for a power grab. On August 19th, a crowd of 200,000 achieved their goal, while demoralized Japanese soldiers stood idly by. Contrary to Ho's beliefs, the actions in the urban centers inspired rural activists, prompting many from the countryside to seek direction in Hanoi, followed closely by thousands of villagers. Meanwhile, the revolution surpassed the limitations imposed by Indochinese Communist Party policies. Mar notes that while the Viet Minh leaders sought to steer clear of radical demands, developments in various rural districts in late August transcended a mere shift in political power, leading to unpredictable social revolutionary actions. The administration set up by the Viet Minh in Hanoi found itself limited by the myriad of revolutionary committees springing up nationwide. The growing gap between the public's perception of the purpose of the Second World War and the stance of the Indochinese Communist Party raised questions about land ownership. On July 30th, 1945, the party reaffirmed its position, stressing the preservation of existing land ownership. They asserted that once the revolution succeeded and the country gained independence, the land possessed by the wealthy would not be redistributed to the poor. Only the land and assets of aggressors and traitors would be confiscated. Advocates for the fair redistribution of land from wealthy individuals were viewed as threats to the unity of the people and faced punishment. Yet the revolution ignored these constraints. In North Annam and Tonkin, committees took charge of land distribution and confiscated riches from the affluent. In addition, 30,000 miners organized a workers' commune, instituting equal pay and gaining control of mines, public services, railways, and telecommunication systems. This movement continued until the Viet Minh detained its leaders in November of 1945. The situation in the South was even more complex and competitive. Following Japan's defeat, local communists rallied in a village about 40 kilometers from Saigon, planning to make advancements later. Meanwhile, 100,000 individuals paraded through the Cochinese capital under the United National Front banner, with the vanguard youth taking the lead. For a brief moment, it seemed that the Indo-Chinese Communist Party had completely lost control. In this disordered climate, Trotskyist slogans found support. Land to the peasants, nationalization of factories under workers' control, people's committees. These calls struck a chord with and motivated the landless populations in regions such as Mitho, Travin, Sadek, Longshuyen, and Chowdak. Workers in the Funyuan district declared their committee as the sole legitimate authority in the area, a declaration that soon spread. Within 3 weeks, more than 150 independent revolutionary committees emerged. However, the Indochinese Communist Party, deeply rooted in Stalinist thought, was not ready to relinquish control of the South. On August 25th, after 500,000 people marched through Saigon, a Southern Provisional Executive Committee was established to unify the various factions. The Viet Minh swiftly moved to dominate most positions before turning against their challengers. Ho Chi Minh implemented a strict policy, sending a clear message that those who did not comply would face dire consequences. Among the first to suffer was Ta Thu Tao. While managing the revolution, Ho also sought outreach to imperialist forces. On September 2nd, he proclaimed the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi. He began by referencing the United States Declaration of 1776 and followed with words from France's 1791 Declaration of the Rights of Man. Ho conveyed his belief that since the Allied nations acknowledged the principles of self-determination and equality, they would not deny the independence of those who stood with them against fascism. In Cochinchina, Tran Van Jiao, the leader of the Provisional Executive Committee, advised against mass mobilization, which could threaten imperialism. He called for the disarming of all non-government organizations and cautioned that anyone promoting armed resistance against the imperialist allies would be regarded as troublemakers and saboteurs. This announcement came just one day after the arrival of the first Allied troops, who had yet to establish their control. In Hanoi, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam continued to endure, not by collaborating with the imperialists, but due to the rifts among the Allied powers. President Franklin D. Roosevelt concentrated on aiding China, instructing General Wiedemeyer to limit British and French political actions within his area of command. On the other hand, British General Gracie was tasked with liberating Allied territory, which effectively meant reclaiming land from the Vietnamese. To resolve this conflict, the United States and Britain came to a consensus at the Potsdam Conference delineating Vietnam along the 16th parallel between Chinese operations in the north and Mountbatten's leadership in the south. Charles de Gaulle, feeling powerless, faced disappointment as he realized this division significantly weakened imperialist goals. Fortunately for Ho, the Chinese were more focused on their own exploitation than on sustaining a long-term occupation of North Vietnam, and they discreetly recognized the Hanoi government. The situation in Cochinchina was different. The Vietnamese reminded General Gracie that they had fought alongside the Allies against fascism, but his response was blunt. I was welcomed upon my arrival by the Viet Minh, who offered greetings and pleasantries. It was a most unpleasant encounter, and I quickly expelled them. They were clearly communists. Gracie did not hesitate to follow Mountbatten's order to rely on Japanese and French forces to enforce his directives. He recruited a Japanese unit to assist his Gurkhas in removing the Provisional Executive Committee from their offices. On September 21st, he barred all demonstrations, processions, public gatherings, and the carrying of arms by the Vietnamese. The next day, under martial law, groups identified by the Times as members of the French Maquis were unleashed in the southern capital. In truth, many of these individuals were French soldiers and legionnaires associated with the Vichy regime from the Decoux period. Some were even Waffen-SS who had recently been released from Japanese prisoner of war camps. They rampaged through the city, shouting insults, assaulting, detaining, and mistreating any locals they encountered. In response, the Viet Minh called for a general strike, which sparked open conflict. One eyewitness recounted how the sounds of gunfire and mortar explosions quickly filled the air as armed Viet Minh squads attacked the airport, set the central market on fire, and stormed the local prison to liberate hundreds of Vietnamese inmates. Many French civilians lost their lives shortly afterward. Due to the chaos among the local French forces, Gracie pulled them back, waiting for reinforcements from France on October 5th, and increasingly relied on the Japanese. The Japanese were assigned to combat roles, with the official history of the 20th Indian Division pointing out that all the difficult tasks, such as fighting and disarming the Vietnamese, were entrusted to Japanese troops. This led to an unusual alliance of Allied victor forces and defeated Axis powers, with Japanese guards and their imprisoned collaborators teaming up to eliminate Vietnamese governance in their own land. By February 1946, British forces had lost 40 soldiers, France had lost 106, and Japan had lost 110. In stark contrast, at least 3,026 Vietnamese were killed, 1,825 by the French, 651 by British forces, and 550 by the Japanese. The last British troops left in March 1946, leaving the French in control south of the 16th parallel, intent on expanding their influence northward. Ho's efforts to navigate between the two wars ultimately fell short. His plea for imperial support to achieve independence did not bear fruit. While the delayed push for mass mobilization led to success in Hanoi, it also allowed the enemy to maintain control in the south. This discrepancy between General Giap's aspirations and his actual actions illustrates the intricacy of the situation. In early September 1945, he contended that the major powers in the Democratic Alliance were advocating for equality among nations. Therefore, it was illogical for them to support French imperialism in oppressing and exploiting the Vietnamese people. He asserted that after fighting alongside the Allies against Japanese fascism in Indochina and playing a significant role in the Pacific conflict, the Vietnamese could not be expected to endure the harsh rule of French colonialists, who had earlier allowed Japan to use Indochina as a base for assaults on the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, and South China. Nevertheless, this same leader orchestrated the stunning defeat of the French army at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, which also marked the decline of the Americans who followed. The 30-year Vietnam War became a pivotal anti-imperialist struggle of the 20th century and a powerful illustration of a people's war. The result was an independent nation, though it was run by a dictatorial state capitalist regime. Many of the social and economic hopes of ordinary people were left unfulfilled during this time, and when the choice between nationalism or socialism arose, the government staunchly opted for nationalism. In Vietnam, like in many other regions, the Second World War intertwined political, social, and economic elements in ways that led to unforeseen results. Ho Chi Minh's initial strategy of depending on various imperialist powers turned out to be a mistake, ultimately bringing him to reluctantly realize that a people's war was the only path to genuine independence. He remarked, "The war is won, but we small and subject countries have no share, or very small share, in the victory of freedom and democracy. If we wish to gain a meaningful share, we must continue to fight." The conventional view of the war against the Axis recognizes the involvement of official armies along with resistance movements, featuring generals and privates, the affluent and the poor, while emphasizing their unity and collective efforts to eradicate the evils of Axis rule. However, the distinctions among participants were not merely variations of a common goal. They illustrated fundamentally differing processes regarding aims, ideology, tactics, and social frameworks. From 1939 to 1945, the presence of parallel wars was the rule rather than the exception, despite not being widely acknowledged. The apparent unity hid deeper divisions, and the notion of the Second World War as a single event serves more as a convenient myth. A clear example of this disparity is the assumed shared opposition to fascism. During the Spanish Civil War, the Western Allies favored Francisco Franco over the Republic, continuing their support for him even after the conflict ended. Hostilities with Germany only began after efforts to appease Hitler failed to contain his territorial ambitions in Franco-British territories. Throughout the war and even afterward, the Allies were willing to collaborate with Axis forces in indirect ways, such as with Admiral Darlan, the abandonment of the Warsaw Uprising, or the collaborationist militias in Greece, as well as directly by employing Japanese troops in Indonesia and Vietnam. Thus, although it may seem intertwined, the people's fight against fascism did not align with the Allied government's battle against the Axis. The conflicts also diverged in other significant ways. The ruling classes of the Allies aimed to protect their privileged positions from various threats, both internal and external, while popular armed struggles sought genuine human liberation and a fairer, democratic future. Imperialists readily sacrificed lives to achieve their goals, while partisans and guerrillas worked to safeguard local civilians and considered the repercussions of their actions. Conventional soldiers operated under a strict hierarchy, pledging to obey without question, whereas the fighters in the People's War, whether in Cairo's soldiers' parliament, Detroit's neighborhoods, or the mountains of Greece, Yugoslavia, and Italy, were aware volunteers motivated by strong ideological beliefs. One may reasonably wonder if labeling the Second World War as parallel wars on the Allied side is merely imposing a broad theoretical framework on a series of unrelated occurrences. Why not, as many traditional histories do, simply present the facts? Yet in doing so, they shift from labeling the entire conflict from 1939 to 1945 with a single term to breaking this period into a collection of isolated incidents connected only by military actions. In reality, every historical event stands alone and resists direct comparison because conditions are never identical. General concepts often simplify rich details into an analytical perspective. History, particularly modern history, is shaped by interactions that span different times and places, and these interactions require a larger context for understanding. The Second World War is a prime example of this phenomenon. It was the most significant event in human history, taking place across 6 continents and all the oceans. As we delve into the specifics, analyzing the connections between its various episodes uncovers a deeper historical reality. The Second World War was undeniable, and its essential traits deserve scrutiny. Recognizing the existence of parallel conflicts within it suggests that, in dialectical terms, the Second World War represented a unity of opposites. It is not surprising that different groups in society had varied interests and acted in distinct ways, nor that a formal declaration of war did not erase these differences. What distinguished the Second World War was the way these tensions played out as parallel wars instead of merely existing as tensions within a single conflict. To understand this, we need to reflect on the long history of states, warfare, armaments, and the populace. In the Middle Ages, military strength was decentralized. local barons led forces that had loose connections to the monarchy. Wars involved relatively small numbers due to limited transportation and weak central authority, making it difficult to assemble large national armies. However, everything changed in 1789 with the emergence of the modern nation during the French Revolution, which championed liberty, equality, and fraternity. The concept of fraternity included the idea that wars, particularly defensive ones, as all future conflicts would be regarded, were fought for the people, albeit with inherent vagueness. This fraternity was embodied by the emerging nation-state that the masses united to defend against surrounding aristocracies. This very institution also reflected the interests of the ruling class, described in Marx's Communist Manifesto as a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. When national states succeeded in resisting foreign oppression, they represented the interests of the populace. However, as instruments of the ruling class, they protected domestic capitalism from international competition. The year 1789 signified a transformation in military organization. A strong partnership between the French government and its citizens stood against the united monarchies of Europe, giving rise to the idea of mass mobilization. This mobilization, unprecedented in scale, set the stage for Napoleon's vast Grand Army, demonstrating the strategic advantages of large troop numbers while also revealing the technical limitations of the era. Aristocratic mercenary forces succumbed to the effectiveness of Napoleonic tactics. By 1812, his enormous army had triumphed over Russia at Borodino and captured Moscow. However, long communication lines, severe weather, and hunger ultimately contributed to the downfall of the Grand Army. Only 90,000 returned, leading Napoleon to reflect that an army relies on its supply lines. The advancements in production capacity lagged behind the potential for destruction. The Industrial Revolution of the 19th century overcame these challenges. Railways enabled rapid transport of troops and supplies, resulting in battles on an unparalleled scale, such as at Gettysburg and Sadowa-Königgrätz, which involved 170,000 and 425,000 troops, respectively. By the time of the First World War, Russia had assembled an army of 16 million, while Germany had 13 million. Weapons became markedly more lethal as well. Napoleonic muskets had a range of 150 yards and could fire 2 rounds a minute, while First World War rifles could reach a mile at 10 rounds per minute, and machine guns could unleash 400 rounds in the same time. Casualties at the Battle of the Somme in 1916 reached 1.9 million, with the British Army alone firing nearly 1 million shells on the first day, totaling 40,000 tons. Total war, begun by governments but fueled by entire populations on the home front, had arrived. During the French Revolution, it was unclear if the concept of national warfare for the people would persist, or if it was simply a reaction to a particular political context, the struggle between the aristocracy and emerging progressive forces. In a keen observation from that time, Clausewitz noted that modern warfare had transformed into an affair of the whole nation and had adopted an entirely new character. He pondered whether future conflicts in Europe would involve the full strength of governments fighting for significant interests that impacted the citizens, or if there would be a gradual separation between governmental goals and those of the populace. By the 20th century, the dangers posed by the old regime had mostly diminished, and capitalism was solidly established in its imperialist form. In Europe, nationalism was systematically manipulated to fracture and control the working class, and the exploitation by domestic capitalists resembled that of foreign ones, making one question whether everyday people would be as inclined to sacrifice for their country. Nevertheless, a strong counterforce was also at play. The competitive and aggressive nature of capitalism, along with the states it fostered, prompted many to unite behind their national governments in the face of external threats. Therefore, by 1914, the concerns expressed by Clausewitz regarding the connection between the state and the citizens during times of war had not yet been resolved. The First World War broke out with tremendous zeal, exemplified by the iconic Kitchener recruitment poster that declared, "Your country needs you." Yet, by 1918, Countless individuals would have echoed the Bolshevik claim that official patriotism is a mask for the exploiting interests. The divide between the people and their governments, as anticipated by Clausewitz, became clear through revolutions that brought down governments in Russia, Germany, and Austria. At the same time, in the victorious countries, mutinies, widespread strikes, and factory occupations were common. The First World War did not create a people's war alongside an imperialist one, but rather resulted in mass uprisings aimed at ending a war driven by imperialism. The Second World War would be markedly different from the first in numerous ways. Haunted by the memories of the conflict from 1914 to 1918, the unfulfilled promises of post-war reforms, and the socio-economic turmoil of the interwar years, ordinary people were profoundly affected. By 1939, the Allied governments realized that simple appeals to patriotism would not resonate. Consequently, in documents like the Atlantic Charter, they emphasized the struggle for freedom with renewed urgency and made sweeping promises for improvements after the war. These measures aimed to spark enthusiasm among the public while avoiding the disorder that characterized the years from 1917 to 1919. While the imperialist goals of the Allied governments remained constant, public expectations for liberation and reform had significantly increased since World War I, making them harder to suppress. The rise of fascism and communism introduced a new ideological framework. Fascism, in particular, was a blatant attempt to dismantle working-class organization domestically and pursued aggressive expansion that threatened established imperial powers. This new dynamic inspired ordinary individuals to resist fascism and advocate for their rights and freedoms. The ongoing power struggles seen in World War II echoed those of its predecessor. Additionally, there were notable military differences. The First World War was dominated by extensive trench warfare, which led to relatively stable military lines. In contrast, the blitzkrieg tactics employed during World War II made warfare more fluid, affecting millions with aerial bombardments and enemy occupations. Germany and Japan intentionally shifted military costs onto their conquered lands, resulting in starvation and a desperate hunt for manpower that drove many young men to join resistance groups. The immediate danger posed by Axis aggression, from the London Blitz to full occupation, urged ordinary people to take action rather than depend solely on government intervention. Furthermore, the Axis conquest of extensive territories often resulted in the emergence of collaborators. The ruling class, driven by survival instincts and the desire to use the Gestapo against working-class movements, compromised the illusion of national unity and challenged the ideological supremacy typically associated with capitalism. Even those ruling classes that supported Allied imperialism were reluctant to mobilize their own lower classes. This stagnation created opportunities for new forces to emerge. In Asia, the rapid Axis advances in Europe further weakened colonial powers and opened new avenues for independence. In essence, alongside a violent imperialist conflict, the conditions then were remarkably conducive to grassroots movements pursuing national and social freedom. The extent to which the fighting from 1939 to 1945 exceeded a standard defense of capitalism was not an exception, but rather an expected evolution of prior trends. The People's War had its imperfections and merits. As a combination of class and national identity, it proved unsustainable over time. Frequently, its forces disbanded quickly, as observed in Germany and France. Even in situations where they gained control, such as in Yugoslavia and Vietnam, the new governments often reinforced the national state as the framework for capitalism, turning the populace into subjects of exploitation. The effect of this movement on the defeat of the Axis powers is also debatable. Keegan might be overly critical in claiming that resistance movements contributed little to the Allied victory, suggesting that these efforts should be viewed as insignificant and futile. In January 1944, Yugoslav partisans were engaged with 15 German divisions, and on D-Day, the French resistance obstructed 12 divisions. Nevertheless, these achievements seem minor compared to the hundreds of divisions deployed by the Allied forces, who had support from taxes, financial resources, arms manufacturing, and the strength of well-equipped conventional armies. However, the People's War extended beyond just resistance groups. Millions in conventional armies were dedicated to combating Axis oppression, and, by extension, tyranny in general. This was clearly acknowledged by the Allied governments, all of whom adopted the cause of anti-fascism. Overy correctly points out that everyday people worldwide believed they were fighting for a just cause, which gave them a significant moral edge. This belief was primarily directed against Germany, Italy, and Japan, but it could just as easily apply to the Allies. When considering whether the Second World War was an imperialist struggle or a people's conflict, the answer is that it was both. However, the balance between the two varied greatly across regions, influenced significantly by subjective factors such as the involvement of communists. While the Hitler-Stalin Pact was in effect, the Communist parties labeled the Second World War as an imperialist conflict. Yet, following Operation Barbarossa, they quickly shifted to lead the People's War. Their association with the victorious Red Army enhanced their popularity. The Communists were motivated by a genuine commitment to social progress and justice, even though the rigid loyalty of their leaders to Moscow often undermined the very movements they helped initiate. It's essential to understand that the People's War was not merely a communist initiative. A range of movements took shape during this time, including the Quit India struggle, which faced opposition from the Indian Communist Party, and the Warsaw Insurgents, along with the Double Victory campaign in the United States. Various objective factors played a role in these dynamics. Countries situated between imperialist powers like Yugoslavia, Greece, Poland, and Latvia showed different interactions involving People's War and conflict driven by imperialism. In Yugoslavia, Mihailovich was more afraid of the partisans than of the enemy and chose to collaborate with them, forcing the British and Russians to support Tito's partisans as the sole group standing against the Axis forces. Thus, moments arose where People's War and imperialist interests coincided. In Greece, the EAM-ELS, with communist influence, gained some support from the Allies. Nonetheless, after the Percentages Agreement firmly placed Greece in the British sphere, Churchill bombed Athens and reinstated the harsh monarchy. This situation led to intense and violent clashes between the two wars. In Poland, Stalin's brutal methods paired with widespread Nazi violence drew those loyal to imperialism together with the wider populace for a common cause. This culminated in the Warsaw Uprising, reflecting both wars, yet ultimately left behind by Stalin amid German retaliation. Latvia found itself trapped between warring imperialist factions, forcing its population to make a grim choice. Thus, a People's War never came to fruition. In the heartlands of the Allied nations, it often became challenging to tell apart those combating fascism from those sustaining empires. In the United States, deep racial tensions led to riots and violent clashes at home. In Britain, the general election of 1945 highlighted a stark divide, indicating that the general public and the ruling elite were engaged in separate but parallel struggles. The most significant split was evident in France, where the ruling class was divided between de Gaulle and Pétain, yet an independent resistance arose. In Axis countries, conditions were generally less conducive to parallel struggles. In Germany, opposition from the ruling elite emerged only when their imperial interests were jeopardized, and it did not support a people's war. Additionally, severe repression hindered grassroots movements, which could only emerge after the Nazi regime was dismantled from outside. The two wars were framed as a clash between the Allies and the Antifa resistance. A similar situation could have arisen in Austria. However, the Allies sought to separate it from Germany and linked its ruling class, burdened by fascism and collaboration, to the anti-Nazi movement. This connection made it difficult for a people's war to take hold there. Italy was different, as Mussolini's control weakened before the Allies reached the north, allowing the People's War to pose a significant threat to both the Nazi occupiers and their local supporters. Although General Alexander nearly suggested that the Nazis eliminate the Italian resistance, which quickly dissolved after the war ended, the impact of the Italian resistance remained significant. In Asia, the interplay between imperialist war and People's War was shaped by the waning power of European colonial rulers and Japan's misleading claims to anti-imperialism. In India, resistance took the form of a direct anti-colonial movement through the Quit India campaign, or sought Japanese support to expel Britain, as with the Indian National Army. After some hesitation from Sukarno, Indonesia's People's War involved armed confrontations with all imperialist forces present, including the Japanese, British, and Dutch. The Vietnamese Communist Party initially sought support from the Allies, but, after being denied, turned to grassroots mobilization to build a strong anti-imperialist movement. The Second World War was unprecedented. It unleashed unimaginable horrors, such as the Holocaust, nuclear destruction, widespread famine, and tremendous civilian casualties, but it is often recalled as the Good War for defeating Nazism and fascism. As Clausewitz pointed out, warfare goes beyond simple tactics. It mirrors deeper political currents, and these dual aspects of the Second World War continued to resonate beyond 1945. To reframe his observation, during peaceful times, politics continues the struggle, albeit in a different manner. Even when the fighting ceased, competition among empires persisted, leading into the Cold War. At the same time, the people's struggle transformed into a forceful, at times intense, battle for decolonization, along with initiatives to create welfare states and enhance living conditions. These issues continue to be significant as we move through the 21st century. Imperialism persists through interventions in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, alongside a domestic attack on living standards fueled by economic crises. Fortunately, the spirit of the people's struggle remains strong in the fight against imperialist wars, racism, and fascism, as well as in the defense of the welfare systems established after 1945. As one veteran of the Second World War recently remarked, the resistance arose during a pivotal moment in history. People had to react to an unbearable situation. Today, we too are confronted with unbearable conditions, and we must respond similarly.